Hey people, this is the third part of this Stoning the Scorpion series, and I call this 1 and this 2A. I'm going to call this 2B, but this is the third movie. And I'm showing why the astrology in the Bible, they have a flying eagle in place of the scorpion that we have now. So you really want to watch these two first. This one's 40 minutes. I talk slow. You can speed it up 1.5. It'll only take you 30 minutes to get through it. And this was a little shorter, and I don't know how long this one's going to be because I haven't made it yet. But we'll call it Part 2B, Part 3. And I'm going to continue reading here in Revelations 4 in the Greek, where I read 1 through 4 in the first movie. But this Abraxas, this is the ancient Alpha Omega god way back in the time. You see in the name of Brox, and that's the Hebrew word for lightning, and break is also the word for knees. It means and he worship, the break means down on your knees. He was the driver. That's why in the Latin, the word for the eagle flying, the flying was volante, and when we looked at the translation in Italian, it become the steering wheel. He was the driver. If you're down in the South, black people, if you're white, they might call you a crackers. That's where that come from. You crackers, and he's cracking that whip, the lightning. You see it here in this old astrology. The Scorpio was Abraxas, fast as lightning, flying, the I Omega, I to make the beginning and the end. So this is the god that was sitting at the galactic center. Back in the day, they believed that everything came out the center of the galaxy, and then it all went back into the same place. The black hole, the anus. There's the allegiance, the days and the nights allegiance. Anus, 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 the holy, 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 holy. And I don't know if I get into it to this movie, but I'm going to show you a little bit more about this ancient scorpion. I always get the most from the first and the last line of chapters and pages. And on this last line, it comes to, the IA, I tell you, reads as a U, and it's due. And due to, because of the, and due to. And this wheel here, everybody reads it as a Thelma, and it's not. It's a dilemma. And due to dilemma, you've got a choice. And so this choice, this is an ancient word, come from the writings of Homer in the Odyssey, I believe. All of Homer's writings was about Thalassa, the god of the ocean, which is being pronounced wrong. This is the dollars. The dollars. Dollars are the S's, that's when you draw pictures of ocean, a bunch of S's, the waves. When I go surfing, I like to see the seas of glass like crystal, and it's the dollars as of a line, a big long line of wave, not a bunch of breakers and chops, but just a big long smooth. And when you're sailing, you're surfing, you get up on that wave and you travel fast and a long ways. The dollars is a line. But this dilemma, that's a Homeric word, first time you'll find it. And the Greeks spell it here with 2 M's, but we know that the Greek Bible is not Greek. We can hear the Portuguese and the Romanian and Spanish all spell it with 1 M. But Homer was sailing, and he had a choice, of the dilemma. He was forced to confront, the big rock or the whirlpool. This was known as Scylla and the Charybdis, the big rock and the whirlpool, the female monster. And these are the 2 toxins that you'll find in scorpion's venom. It has 2 different toxins. I talked a little bit about that in the last movie. One of them is Viagra. One of them gives you hard on. But you have a dilemma, because in order to get it, you're going to take the lightning bolts. And this might be a better pronunciation, the care of this, in care of this. You might put it on a letter, in care of this. The cherubim guarding the Garden of Eden with its flaming swords. And Scully, the head. And this is Old Norse for, bottoms up, drink up, skull. They say they used to drink their beer from their parents' skull, and it means to toast. Skull is what they would holler. And if you look in this old Berean Greek Bible, you see the first legend, was the red lettering, was the old writings. And then in the worship of the Creator, at the end it comes to the allegiance of the days and the nights allegiance. And it's offset, it's this allegiance, this pledge to allegiance, the anus. And then the third allegiance down here to the throne of allegiance. And it's offset again, it gives you this allegiance to and due to dilemma. But I'm going to read it here in this Berean Interlinear Bible. It all reads the same. They don't all read the same. There's over 20 different Greek Bibles, and they all have some differences. But in that first movie, you remember I ended here, with the Stephanos, the Crossovs, and the Krusovs, and then it goes into the Victov, the crucifixion, and Victov and out of. And so this is Mars, so Vic. Vic, Mars is this circle with the arrow pointing out, out of Vic. It's your dad pointing at the door telling you get the hell out. You're evicted and out of. And Mars is over here in Scorpio. He's on the throne of Scorpio, and out of the throne, and Victor of the throne of, and come flashes of lightning, and he's talking about Scorpio here. And so the flashes of lightning, that if you Google it, they'll tell you Ben Franklin invented the lightning rod, but they used them thousands of years ago. It says right here, the copper and wantage, strappage, and that's how you keep from getting struck by lightning. Is you put a strappage of copper. When lightning's coming, you be wanting a wantage, the wanting of a copper strappage, and victive throne of the copper wantage a strappage. And phonage and brontage, the sound and the lightning, the cracker, weft all. And so a weft, this base word for this word for hefty, weight, you see when it's followed by another A, this A reads as an I and be hefty. And weft, when you're weaving something on a loom, you have your warp. Your warp is all the lines going straight up and down, and your weft is the one that's passing through. And you adjust the weight, the heft of the carpet by the size and the weave and how you weave it through. The weft were the 7. And so the 7 planets were weaving through the warp. So this by no way means 7. It just means that there were 7. But, the weft, how many of them were actually weaving through? And the weft, the lampades, the lamps, the lights, pure as, to get it pure, you boil it, fire. The pure as a woman, this is a key is a W, Vav, W-O-M-E-N, the womanage. The pure is the womanage. That's Virgo. She was the pure woman. In the no-P peon that came before. There was no man there before, no peon. This is peon. He came after, and the woman came before. You have two of them here. These are the twins. This is Gemini, and you see that they're naked. They don't have no skirt on. You have skirts back here. And the twins are the two Gemini, the two naked. And then you have Cancer. Cancer's eating your liver there. And then you have Leo, and I guess that's the heart. And then you have Virgo, the no peon. These are all no peons that came before. And then you have Libra, the scales. And then you have peon over here, come after, the scorpion. The score, up there, a scoreboard, and the peon. And you see he's carrying the sign of Stephanos, the censor. And then up here you have the official. They call this the narmer, and nar is what you do to the fish. You're gnawing on it, and this is a awl, and a mar is what you do with an awl. You use it to mar something, to make a scratch when you're doing metal work and you can't see a pencil on it. You make a scratch on your copper so you know where to break it. And this isn't a narmer, this is an official. And what it's saying is, it's telling you the date of this. Back in the day, this was the official break line of the new year. And through precession of equinox, this official is now moved up into the front of Virgo. 2,500 years ago, they say this was 4,500 years old or so, but 2,500 years ago, the mark of the official, the beginning of the new year, the beginning of the flood is what come. The day of the flood was in the 6th day of Virgo. And so that just about lines up right, and now it's up here. But at the same time this was moving, this is about the time they came up with Libra. There was no Libra before. Libra was the claws of Scorpio. But as the galactical expansion happens, these stars stretched out, and they added this sign in here. And this Libra, the scales, are the government. And I found it a couple chapters ahead here. And you'll see it in the Greek and the Hebrew Bible. The first day was the day of Mu. The IA reads the U. It means the day of the floods, in Kamar Mu. In the Hebrew, you'll see it in all the days, and there was evening. And so this is the days of Mu. This is the harvest season. And so you don't need a lot of people to plant your fields. But come harvest, it's all hand labor. This is the Mexicans. They just come in for the season to harvest. And so the IE reads the A. You can see it here, the way. And to weigh, and then the tactus reads backwards. The bearer in, and you're coming to the scale man. He's weighing up. And if you're a crop sharer, every time you come into the field, you go through the door, and it's the collect ware. And everybody's forced, they have fences when you're going into the Coliseum for a concert. You got to go through that collect ware. They collect your tickets. And this is the collect ware, the door, where they weigh up everything you bringing in, and the government gets its cut. He takes half if you're a crop sharer. And you see that in Revelation 6 on the black horse, the rider on the black horse. And behold, a black horse sitting on, and upon it having a yoke, balanced scales in his hand. And is each on, and this is the word they'll say is the lamb in the Hebrew, each on, the X on. And you see that in a lot of ancient images, the lamb has an X on him. And then the zugon, and this is the same word they'll give for a tree or the cross. And the N, followed by the E, is reading as a V. And so the Z is the cut. And each on cut, a govern, the share what of. The government shares. You coming out the field, they weigh you up, you a sharecropper, the government takes half. The GOVEN, the govern, the share, and the IA reading is a VOV, is a VOV, WUT, the what of, the government share what of, his cut, the cut a gov, and the share what of, and to catch them in as, the caminos is the road, catch them on the road, and of catch coming as, coming from the field on the road, the catch coming as, you get them at the door, where they got to go through to get to the city. The pot of each on, the government, the zoo, the cut of govern, the share what of, the government wanting his share. And you see that on this old Zodiac, not only does he hold the scales, but he has a measure, You're going to measure out half for me, half for the government, half for the sharecroppers, a tenth for the migrant pickers. And so this black, it's not what you saw, it's what you smelled, a smell as, SMEL, the smell as. And I do a whiff, a WIF, a whiff. And we see a double consonant followed by a vowel. You move that vowel between, it reads twice. And it's I do whiff of, as smell, as walk, the walk it coming as, the pot of each on is the governed share you what of. And so, the horse, it's not only what you whip the whip as, but it's also what you whiff. You can smell it. And so old Crackers, he was whipping and smelling. So this would have been the time before there was a Libra. And you can see that, in the first two words in the prelude of Genesis. Genesis really doesn't start till Genesis 2:4, is the book of Genesis. And all that come before was the prelude. The prelude's written after the rest of the book was written. The in rash, the bras it bear. But Genesis doesn't start till here, and these are the generations. You see it better in the Greek. And this is the vival as, the life as Genesis. And so this word for the flashes of lightning, the base of it is Astra. Astra, the stars. And that's what governed everything. Back in the day, the government, the law had everything to do with the stars. If it was in the stars, that's where your word disaster comes from. A dis, and when you're culling through your fruit, you have some bad ones, you diss them, you put them out. And a bad star is a disaster. You see that here in 12, and a sign great appeared in the heavens. And then it'll start talking about the stars here. The star is the asteron. And if you have a bad star, that's a disasteron. Base word, aster, astra. And victive throne of the copper want. And the IA reading is a U here, AV. The copper want of star pay. The stars pay. Their pay is good or bad. And the pay coming from this star was the copper want. I want a lightning rod. And phonage, and the sound, the thunder, and the lightning, the copper wantage, a strappage, the lightning. and the phonage and the thunder, and brontage, the weft, as lightning shoots across the sky, and the brontage weft. Lampades, fire is woman, woman is burning, she is hot, the womanage. And that AIE, reads as age, AJE, the age, and the woman age, no peon, not behind. Totter on of, the daughter on of, ascision, the AE, read it with an S between, ascision, decision, and totter of ascision, of decept, DES, the AE reads as a E, deceptive in whom, who am, and whom add a thought, how, deceptive, and the woman age of no peon, totter on of ascision, the decision, and that's what come up in the last line was the dilemma, that had a decision, deceptive in whom added thought how, to think of how to deceive, and we, us, we, no peon, us before, a totter on of, as the dollars, as of, DALAS, the dollars, the money. When that sea is like glass, that's money. That boat is traveling fast. You're getting your goods there quick. That's dollars. The god of the sea. That we want to see the dollars. The dollars as of a line. The seas as of a line. And a line of, a line home, a home, and an IA reading as a vav, the home of, and crystal all, and dollars as of a line home of crystal all, and crystal is green, not the white water, the green water, and when, at that time, when, and from esoteric knowledge, inside, from inside, and when from in, a totter on of, a cycle, the omega looks like an E, and sometimes it reads as a E, CYCLE, not around, a bicycle has two cycles, has two wheels, and the cycle totter on of a Sarah, that a Tessa, the A is reading where that second S is. A Tessa was the harvest season, which wasn't a four. There was only 3 seasons in the old Egyptian where this word a Tessa come from, so it means more is harvest than for. And then a Sarah is will be, and a cycle totter on of the harvest will be. K Sarah will be. K what Sarah will be, and the harvest will be, and Tess Sarah. And a zoo on a mount. A zoo is when there's a bunch of people there. It was like a zoo, all those living creatures. The zoo, and the G reading is N here. The zoo on, and a mount. When you get up on your horse, a mount, from, on, to, and the zoo on a mount. And the eyes are a tell, of tell 'em on, and of tell 'em of, followed by the E. And that's what the eyes for. And you see in Egyptian art, that's what the Nephilim had taught the women, the painting of their eyes, of the tell 'em of. You can tell by their eyes if it's a hooker. Of telem of improstin. You know, like improvise is that's where his front's coming from. Is you didn't have any prior knowledge to this. You know, improstin, the front. You know, not for. You know, didn't have any foresight of what was coming. And no force then, and of piston. And piston is what's happened, you know, if you're downwind, and piston to come after, you know, in front and after, you know, and on amount, how much of telem of improstin and of piston. And to zone. The zone comes from a girdle, you know, no hitting below the belt, the zone. And to zone, top, the top wrote on, the same, a homo, and the I-O reads the E, the same in, and a li on tie, you know, L-E, two on tie. And the zone top wrote on, homo in, two on tie. And that's the sign of Leo. You know, his sign is the noose, a rope. And to a deuteron, you know, the tutor, the shaped on zone, the homo, the same in mushy. And that's mushy. And I know that's mushy because the word is the fattened calf. You don't want no old bull that's been pulling the plow. You want a young fat one. A young shoot. It's mushy. A tender juicy shoot. A sprout of the plant. So this is Easter. It's your plant day. You know, and this is the young, the mushy. You know, and you're coming up through summer. And then you get down to your harvest over here. Virgo. And to the Triton zone, you know, is what at right on the zone. This isn't zone, it's followed by the E. But the right on zoo of, you know, all living creatures of each on, you know, living creature having, each one has, of each on, to prosip on, as on drop of, to the perspire is where that comes from, to the perspirate, to precipitation, to precip on, as on drop of, you know, on drop of. So you can tell that the interpreter, you know, he can't read, he's just looking at the pictures and writing what he saw. But this is the cloud, Aquarius, and he's perspiring, precipitation, but he has the face of a man, but it's the percipon. And so the percipon is not the face, the percipon is the sweat. And so you can see it's talking about the Leo and the Musho and the percipon drop of, and it's the four winds, and then Scorpio. And what it right on zoo of each on to percipon as on drop of, and to a teetered on. Teetered is a fourth leg. You got to get the fourth leg perfect. You know, 3 legs always stand even, but the fourth leg, if it's a little short or a little long, it teeters. And the fourth leg was always a little longer. You know, 365 does not divide by 4. You know, it was always a little longer. And so the teetered on zone, a same in acetophetamine. You know, the AE reads as a ASC or ACE, acetophetamine. You know, the omega reading as a E here. amphetamine. And so aceta, that comes from acetic acid. They've been known about it for thousands of years. It's vinegar is acetic acid. There's 100 yeasts that floating around in the air, and only 2 of them you can make wine of, or 3 of them. I think they might even have some more new ones, some new improved wines that don't die in alcohol content they used to. But any of those other 98 yeasts, if they happen to land in your batch of wine, you make a batch of vinegar. The vinegar came before wine. Acetic acid, aceta, acetamphetamine, acid, speed. And you see it in all this old ancient alchemical art. There's always a dragon and a bird flying and a bird on his head. And the people in the drug business, they knew that this was code. They knew it, this is in the pot. This is what he's cooking up. The people that knew how to read this, they were cooking up the drugs. They knew how to read the Bible. It wasn't for a bunch of peons. Peons, you get what comes after. After we cook it up, you can test it out. It's the same as these new COVID vaccines. We're going to cook it up, and then after the peons can try it out. And to the harvest will be, the tes sarah, the zoo is in, the catching of 2 in, each on above, a feather when as, corruptible, on a feather when as, the pimp, it's psych loading, and eso, inside then. And this G here reads as an N, a Nemo, nobody was in. Full is the opposite of Nemo was in. Nobody was in of tell 'em on. Nobody told you. They just give it to you to see what would happen. And on a pause in, a pause comes from a nap of Zen, a rest and take a nap of Zen, or ana above pausing. And the K followed by the E reads the L, the owl. And each of Zen, that's the secret club. They go worship that owl every year. And it's the people that know how to read. You see the people that belong to that club, the Bohemian club, they're all writers. They're ones that understand how to read this. And the owl, each of Zen, comer as when us to. The owl, each of Zen comer as when us to. The ones that know how to read this. When us to's allegiance. And then they say their allegiance. Anus, the G reading is an N. Anus. Anus is the old fish-headed god that taught men. Anus, asshole, asshole, asshole. Cure, I-O reading is E. The cures at, has, of, upon to crater. Upon to, that's what they say is all to. Crater is govern. Upon to govern. Kratos, strength, intelligence. The crater is the one with the strength and intelligence. Anus, anus, anus. Cures it has upon to the governor, the intelligence, or the one with the intelligence. Of in, and of on, and of here, coming as. It's talking about the astrology, the knowledge, the crater of the pan to, the pan all around to, the knowledge of in and of on and of here coming as. And I don't know if I ever told you this, but I had a friend, he was working at Sterling Industries. That's where they make milk of magnesia. And he was a operator, machinery operator. He operated the machine that put the labels on the bottles after they filled them. And he told me on the days when they start a new batch, he was there because they're emptying the old batch, and he's making sure all the labels are straight on the bottles. He said when they start the new batch, they have an astrologer come in, a Jewish astrologer, a bunch of paperwork and astrological charts to make sure they kick off the next batch at the right time, to make sure the stars are just right when they kick it off. So if you don't believe in astrology, the people with big money do. So hooty hoo, this is the club, and this is the ones in the know. In old Egypt, that owl, they say it's the letter M, so you can read that owl as just from, but it has a lot more meaning. It means from the law. You see that owl often in a judgment. If there was a court case and there was a judgment, and this is now law from this day forward, and that's what that owl means. And I'm going to cut this off here. Hooty hoo.